Alonzo Mann, Afraid, for 69 years. Alonzo Mann is presented in the Tennessean as a timid and obedient mama's boy who complied with the wishes of his parents and kept quiet about a murder and watched an innocent white man die for the crime of a, quote, negra, end quote. He said to the paper in 1982, quote, I told my mother what happened, and she says, don't say anything about it, and we will wait and see how it comes out. So the next morning they find Mary Fagan, and my mother says, don't say anything about it because we don't want to get involved in it. End quote. The Tennessean writers work hard to create the impression that Mann was gripped by fear, which prevented him from revealing the, quote, truth, end quote, that only he knew. The article titled, quote, Terrified Boy Feared for His Life, end quote, by Frank Ritter, reinforces that idea, characterizing Mann as, quote, paralyzed, end quote, fearful, end quote, terrified, end quote. In the Tennessean's deliberately provocative racial imagery, quote, Conley held her in a bear hug, his powerful arms wrapped tightly around her adolescent waist, end quote. The writers would like readers to accept that Alonzo Mann's white parents allowed a rapacious black murderer to return to the scene of the crime where their own child was employed, along with scores of white women and adolescent girls. Mann is goaded by the Tennessean to elaborate even further on that absurd scenario when he makes the pronouncement, quote, From then on, whenever I was at work, I steered clear of Jim Conley. I kept away from him, and he did the same. End quote. Thus, Mann's parents allowed him to go back several times to a place where a child murderer was known to lurk, a murderer who had knowledge that Mann was the only witness to his lynchable crime. Whilst this fear seemed to silence Alonzo Mann, the young women of the factory, who had accepted Frank's suggestion that, quote, a Negro, end quote, was the murderer, evinced no such fear, as they confronted Conley at work at the factory to accuse him of the crime to his face. Factory worker Mary Pierk testified that she had directly accused Conley of the crime, whereupon, quote, he took his broom and walked right out of the office, and I have never seen him since, end quote, she recalled. Alonzo Mann's immaculate conversation with Leo Frank. Yet another inconsistent part of Mann's 1982 story is his stating that on the day of the murder he had had a conversation with Leo Frank in which he told his boss that he wanted to leave at 11:30 on the morning of the murder. Quote, Mr. Frank agreed for me to leave at that time. I told him I would return to the office and complete my filing work later in the afternoon. He said he expected he would still be there. End quote. If true, Mann's statement makes Leo Frank a party to a conversation that his lawyers desperately needed and could have used to prove that Frank's encounter with Mary Fagan was not at all premeditated. Georgia State Prosecutor Hugh Dorsey maintained that Frank had hired Conley on Friday to guard the door for his anticipated encounter with Mary Fagan on Saturday. Frank's own day watchman, E.F. Holloway, testified that when he left the factory at 11:45 on Saturday morning, quote, Mr. Frank said to me, you can go ahead if you want to. We will all go at noon. End quote. This testimony helped the prosecution establish that Frank was trying to clear the building for his intended sexual rendezvous that afternoon. So if Frank had expected Alonzo Mann to return during the afternoon, then Frank's attorneys could have more successfully, even convincingly, undermined the prosecution's attempt to establish Frank's motive. Leo Frank recalls every detail of his movements on that day, but not this exculpatory conversation with Mann, and Mann never mentioned it at the time when it would have been most useful. Even if he were, quote, afraid, end quote, of Jim Conley, as he claims, his testimony of this conversation between boss and employee would have had no bearing on his, quote, commitment, end quote, to Conley to remain quiet. Indeed, Frank's attorneys were so desperate for such evidence that they actually invented a similar scenario, which they added to Frank's version of events. During the coroner's inquest, 10 days after the murder, Frank suddenly, quote, remembered, end quote, that his foreman, Lemmy Quinn, had, quote, visited, end quote, him in the factory at the exact moment of the murder. Incredibly, Quinn's memory returned to him at the very same time. That was almost certainly conspiratorial perjury, but there can be no question that if the conversation between Frank and Mann had occurred, Frank's attorneys would unhesitatingly have had little Lonnie confirm it on the witness stand. Further, Mann and the Tennessean would like us to believe that on a Saturday and a holiday, a 13-year-old boy who has the option of going to a movie, attending a parade, or returning to a factory to, quote, complete my filing work, end quote, that his boss does not recall or expect him to do, would choose the latter. Mann versus Frank. Irreconcilable differences. What Leo Frank did remember about Alonzo's presence on that fateful day creates an impossible dilemma for Alonzo Mann. The most consistent part of Mann's 1913 story is that he left the factory at 11:30 a.m. He says this to investigators on 3 separate occasions in May 1913, and then again a 4th time while under oath at Leo Frank's trial. But the defendant himself placed the time a full half-hour later. Police officer W.W. Rogers investigated the murder and directly quoted Frank on Mann's departure time. Quote, "My stenographer left about 12 o'clock, and a few minutes after she left, the office boy left, and Mary came in and got her money and left." End quote. Hattie Hall is the stenographer in question, and she testified at the trial that, quote, "When I pushed the clock, it was 2 minutes past 12, end quote. And Frank emphatically concurred that, quote, "Miss Hattie Hall is an unimpeached and unimpeachable witness, and her testimony must stand," end quote. And here is where it gets impossibly tight for Alonzo Mann's 1982 claims, 69 years after Frank's murder conviction. Frank estimated that Mary Fagan left his office with her pay envelope after 12:07 p.m. If we are to believe Leo Frank and his carefully scripted, but often changing, timeline, Mary was then murdered by James Conley at about 12:10. If Frank's timeline is correct, and he was emphatic that it is, then Mann must have accomplished an impossible 16 to 19-minute sequence of activities within a 7-minute window, between 12:02 and 12:09 p.m., before returning to catch, quote, Jim Conley with a girl in his arm, end quote. Alonzo Mann's 1982 interrogators at the Tennessean obviously never knew that in 1913, Mann had told investigators several versions of his activities after he left the factory. The day after Mary's body was discovered, Frank hired the Pinkerton Agency to conduct the investigation on behalf of the National Pencil Company, and subsequently the Pinkertons interviewed Alonzo Mann 3 separate times, May 6th, 7th, and 9th. Within a span of 4 days, Alonzo Mann gave 3 different stories about events that occurred less than 2 weeks before. And those stories conflict with his testimony at trial 4 months later. And both the Pinkerton report and his trial testimony conflict with his latest tale in 1982. Why Mann was not more thoroughly investigated, given his differing statements, and why Frank's attorneys seem to have kept Mann's blatant inconsistencies out of the public eye, have yet to be explored. Certainly, other employees were arrested or held on far, far less, or for no suspicious behavior at all. In his May 7, 1913 interview, Mann is quoted using the language, quote, "I do not remember," end quote, or similar phrase, 9 times. In 1982, he settled on this version. Quote, "I was supposed to meet my mother that day about noon and go to the Confederate Memorial Day parade. When I left the premises just before noon," end quote. His 12 noon meeting with his mother at the Vaudette Motion Picture Theater remains throughout all 3 Pinkerton interviews. But Alonzo's companion, quote, Philip, end quote, disappears in the first and third versions of his story, as does the visit to the barbershop and haberdashery. And his brother gets lost in his third version of events. In the first Pinkerton interview, Mann says he visited, quote, a number of moving picture shows, end quote. But in the third, he says he visited just 2. Mann mentioned his visit to Thomason's printing company in only 2 of the 3 interviews, and he told Pinkerton investigators in the initial interview that he watched the parade, but does not mention it again in the second and third interviews or at trial. After 69 years, the reason for the 12 noon meeting changes. At first, the reason for meeting his mother was to buy a cap for himself, but in 1982, it was his mother's need for a hat that he remembers. Below is a chart comparing the differing statements of Alonzo Mann. One must remember the effort that was made at the Frank trial to account for every minute and every movement of those in and around the factory on the day of the murder. This makes the inconsistencies in Mann's statements within a few days of the murder all the more perplexing. Alonzo Mann, Then and Now. May 6, 1913. Arrived at factory at 7:30 a.m. On arrival, saw E.F. Holloway. Left factory at 11:30 a.m. Went to Vaudette Theater, 74 Whitehall Street, where he met his mother at 12 noon. Watched the parade, and, quote, visited a number of moving picture shows, end quote. Met his brother about 5 p.m. and went home, arriving at dark. May 7, 1913. Arrived at factory at 7 o'clock a.m. Saw Holloway, Irby, the shipping clerk, and Mack, the drayman. Left factory at 11:30 a.m. Went to Vaudette Motion Picture Theater, met his mother at 12 noon, talked with mother for 5 minutes in front of theater. Went to Thomason's printing company where his brother is employed. Met boy named Philip and went to gas office, which was closed at 12:35 p.m. Went with Philip to haberdasher on Marietta Street, quote, where I purchased a cap, end quote. Left Philip and went to barbershop on Viaduct Place. May 9, 1913. Left factory at 11:30 a.m. Went to Vaudette Motion Picture Theater. Met his mother at 12 noon. Went to Thomason's printing company, quote, with my mother, end quote. Quote, walked about the streets, end quote. Visited 2 moving picture shows. Went home about 6 o'clock p.m. At trial, August 12, 1913. Quote, I worked there 2 Saturday afternoons and stayed there until 3:30 or 4, end quote. Saw Holloway, Irby, McCrary, and Darley. Left factory at 11:30 a.m. 83 years old. March 7, 1982. Arrived at factory at 8 o'clock a.m. Quote, I worked half a day on Saturday, end quote. On arrival, saw Jim Conley. Left, quote, just before noon, end quote. Bought a hot dog on his way to meet his mother, quote, in front of a store on Whitehall Street, end quote, where, quote, she had planned to buy a hat, end quote, and then, quote, go to the parade, end quote. Waited, quote, for a few minutes, end quote, for his mom, who never showed up. Went back to the factory and saw Conley carrying the limp body of Mary Fagan. Quote, I took a couple of steps up, and I saw the door was locked or shut, and I didn't go on up, so I turned around and went out the door and went home. End quote. Mann's videotaped statement, November 10, 1982. Quote, a little after 12 o'clock, end quote, went back to factory and saw, quote, Jim Conley with a girl in his arm and she was limp. End quote. Quote, I told my mother what happened and she says, don't say anything about it and we will wait and see how it comes out. End quote. Despite the boy's many conflicting statements, investigators apparently never questioned Alonzo Mann's mother, brother, friend, barber, haberdasher, or theater staff. In a case where minutes and seconds were so significant and critical and were argued over in court, in the press, and by historians hence, it is an incredible oversight for the original investigators to have not followed up on the discrepancies of Mann's many stories, and an even greater blunder for those who promote Alonzo Mann as having solved the murder of Mary Fagan. The cunning Leo Frank and the disappearing Alonzo Mann. Quote, question. Where did she go when she left the office? Answer. I heard her footsteps dying away. End quote. Leo Frank's sworn testimony before the coroner's inquest. In his carefully scripted, lawyer-reviewed statement about his own movements on the day of the murder, Leo Frank does not account for the departure of Alonzo Mann. Right after the murder, Frank tells investigators that Mann left the factory after Hattie Hall left at 12:02 p.m., and he describes the arrivals and departures of every employee he had come in contact with on April 26th, except James Conley, of course. But at Frank's own trial, Alonzo's departure is unaccounted for, and no one, not the police, prosecutors, or press, seems to have noticed. And further, Frank let slip some mysterious language on the witness stand that suggests a new role for Alonzo Mann. On page 182 of the Brief of Evidence, Frank recounts his actions just moments before Mary Fagan arrived. Quote, Miss Hall finished the work and started to leave when the 12 o'clock whistle blew. She left the office and returned. It looked to me, almost immediately, calling into my office that she had forgotten something, and then she left for good. End quote. 12:02 p.m. Quote, Then I started in. We transcribed. First we enter all orders into the House Order Book. Defendant's Exhibit 12. All these orders which Miss Hall had acknowledged, I entered in that book. End quote. Leo Frank twice used the term, quote, we, end quote, in reference to work he said was performed right before Mary Fagan arrived at 12:07 by his accounting. He used, quote, we, end quote, before he reverted to using the first-person singular pronoun, quote, I, end quote. Later, Frank and his lawyers produced a timeline in which Mann's presence is acknowledged, but his departure time is unaccounted for. This may have been a calculated oversight. Frank and his team of lawyers wanted to give the jurors the impression of a bustling and well-trafficked office, and imply that Frank was not alone when Mary came to collect her pay. Frank makes other subtle suggestions of an active factory workday, even though he and Mary were now the only ones known to be on the second floor. Frank testified to the coroner about Mary's visit. Quote, This little girl who was killed came up and got her envelope. I didn't see or hear anyone with her. I didn't hear her speak to anyone who might have been outside. End quote. Who, quote, might have been outside, end quote, is not disclosed, but by Leo Frank's own account, it, quote, might have been, end quote, Alonzo Mann. These incredible conflicts of testimonies concerning the whereabouts of Alonzo Mann vis-a-vis his employer, so close to the time of the murder, should have piqued the interest and the attention of the state prosecutors, but those differing accounts have never been fully examined. In light of these unresolved scenarios, the, quote, nervousness and trepidation, fear and anxiety, end quote, Mann had exhibited during his appearance at the Leo Frank trial may very well have indicated a covert, unspoken role on the day of the murder. The Tennessean joins the Frank propaganda team. From the beginning, the advocates for Leo Frank have had the benefit of a cooperative press to bolster their cause. The New York Times, under Adolph Ochs, almost single-handedly repackaged Frank's depravity and sold it to the entire world as Frank's martyrdom. In 1982, the Nashville Tennessean, under John Seigenthaler, stepped forth to fill that crusading role to declare Frank's innocence in a crime that had troubled the Jewish world for 69 years. Seigenthaler had no intention of bringing a fresh critical eye to a perplexing cold case. His single-minded objective was to exonerate Leo Frank and pin Mary Fagan's murder on James Conley, and that caused the Tennessean to abandon any trace of journalistic ethics. It neither questioned nor pursued any of the blatant discrepancies, obvious conflicts, and confused fantasies inherent in man's many stories, before accepting his, quote, confession, end quote, entirely at face value. And further, the paper regurgitated to a brand new audience the very same glaring falsehoods, fabrications, and diversions that have plagued the case for a century, nearly all of which had been handily debunked almost as soon as they appeared in 1913 through 1915. Yet they reappeared unchallenged in 1982, as if they were new revelations. The Tennessean, quote, reporters, end quote, borrowed heavily from the piles of pro-Frank perjuries generated by the nefarious alliance of the William J. Burns Detective Agency and Adolph Ochs's New York Times. In one of the sloppiest pieces of journalism on record, the Tennessean recycled so many of those long-dead myths and lies that it requires a chart to catalog just a few of them. Nashville Tennessean on trial. Falsehoods and Fictions in the March 7, 1982 edition. The trial, quote, kindled the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, end quote. False. The D.W. Griffith movie, The Birth of a Nation, which debuted in 1915, was the impetus for the KKK reemergence. The Frank case, quote, sparked the formation of the ADL, end quote. False. Though the Frank case gave the Anti-Defamation League a powerful promotional symbol, the ADL, a division of the B'nai B'rith, had already been formed in Chicago before the murder of Mary Fagan. The Knights of Mary Fagan was, quote, a secret order, end quote, whose, quote, avowed purpose was to avenge Mary Fagan's death, end quote. False. The group is a New York Times invention. Frank's lynchers never used that name. Quote, the shouts of "crack the Jew's neck" and "damned Sheeny" that were heard in the courtroom alerted Jews throughout the world that Frank's religion was a substantive factor in the case. The jury was deliberating in a mob atmosphere with crowds jamming the streets shouting anti-Semitic slurs. End quote. A, quote, wave of rabid anti-Semitism engulfed Georgia, end quote. And there was, quote, mounting sentiment against Jews, end quote. The trial, quote, was conducted in a frenzied environment with men's shouts of "kill the Jew," end quote. The, quote, trial surrounded by mob hysteria and violent anti-Jewish sentiment. Outside the courtroom, the gang had shouted, "Hang the Jew." Fires of anti-Semitism swept Atlanta during the trial. During the trial, there were frequent catcalls of "kill the Jew," end quote. False. Even Frank's most avid supporters have dropped those false charges from their latest writings. Quote, Jews in Georgia were openly ostracized in the aftermath of the Frank trial. Jews were expelled from some towns. Others were forced to lock their doors and board their windows. In the months following the Frank lynching, half the 3,000 Jews in Georgia left the state. End quote. False. Not a single Jew was, quote, expelled, end quote, from anywhere in Georgia as a result of the Frank case. This Kristallnacht scenario simply never happened. Though Georgia blacks continued to suffer lynchings and burnings alive, the Jewish population actually grew in the years after Frank's lynching. Quote, the Jews who remained in Atlanta were crippled financially by a massive boycott of Jewish businesses. as Jewish residencies were boarded up and as women and children of Jewish families were sent out of the state for their safety. End quote. False. There were no boycotts of Jewish businesses, which in fact thrived before, during, and after the Leo Frank affair, 1913 through 1915. The single known attempt to boycott never materialized. There is evidence that Jewish merchants boycotted Georgia, as did the New York firm of L. Heim and Sons, which refused orders from Georgia, quote, until we are satisfied that law and order has again been restored, end quote. Quote, the ADL, aided by the NAACP, became vigorous in opposing all lynchings. End quote. False. The major NAACP anti-lynching initiative was its energetic support of the Dyer anti-lynching bill in 1918. There is no record of the ADL's involvement in this anti-lynching effort. ADL literature appears to be concerned with but one lynching in American history, that of Leo Frank. Frank's attorney, Lewis Marshall, head of the American Jewish Committee at the time, openly opposed the Dyer bill and successfully worked to destroy it. Quote, at least 3 persons later were quoted as saying, end quote, Conley, quote, confessed to them he was the killer, end quote. False. James Conley always maintained that Leo Frank was the killer of Mary Fagan, and that he was called upon by Frank to help him conceal her body. Conley never, quote, confessed, end quote. Quote, violent men gathered at the state capitol, armed with shotguns, rifles, pistols, and clubs. Among the some 5,000 gathered here, many were spoiling for fights. End quote. False. After claiming that men brandished deadly firearms, the Tennessean then claims that they only, quote, hurled insults, then rocks, bottles, and other missiles at the home of their governor, end quote. In fact, the Atlanta Constitution reported that 1,200, quote, noisy, end quote, demonstrators were at the governor's residence after he commuted Frank's sentence to life in prison, and they were quickly dispersed by guards. Quote, many arrests, end quote, were made, but none of the properties of the National Pencil Company, its management, Leo Frank, his family, or his well-known Jewish supporters were ever touched or even threatened. Quote, armed mobs roamed the streets of Atlanta for days as Jewish store owners closed their businesses and hid behind boarded-up doors and windows. End quote. False. There is no record, report, or testimony of such activity. This description more accurately refers to the 1906 Atlanta massacre of blacks, wherein, for several days, white mob mayhem occurred that included the murder of 50 blacks, the wounding of 150, and over 1,000 forced to flee the city. Judge, quote, Roan disclosed to friends that he believed in the defendant's innocence to have been proven to a mathematical certainty. End quote. False. Judge Leonard S. Roan never professed any doubt about the verdict and reaffirmed this when he denied Frank a new trial and imposed the death sentence immediately after the guilty verdict. Frank's trial attorney, Luther Rosser, quote, strolled in and out of the courthouse, ignoring the shouts of, how much the Jews paying you, Rosser? End quote. False. This story appears to have been made up by author Harry Golden, who in his book, A Little Girl is Dead, adds that the attorneys were, quote, tripped, end quote, and, quote, spat on, end quote. There is no mention of it by Rosser or any other member of Frank's massive legal team. Prosecutor Hugh M. Dorsey, quote, was not hesitant about using questionable legal tactics, end quote. False. The Tennessean gives no examples of the alleged, quote, questionable, end quote, tactics, and no illegalities were claimed in the many court filings of Leo Frank. Frank's operatives, on the other hand, committed numerous illegalities in their attempt to free Frank and frame Newt Lee and James Conley. 2 jurors made anti-Semitic statements. False. Investigation showed this claim to be unfounded. See section herein titled, quote, Leo Frank's Pardon and Crucifixion, end quote. Judge Roan, quote, pleaded with the governor to commute Frank's death sentence. End quote. False. Judge Roan died in March 1915, 2 months before the governor's commutation. He had suffered a debilitating decline in his health for months before he died. Quote, cinders were found under her fingernails, showing she had clawed the ground in her struggles. End quote. False. No testimony was given by the coroner to this effect. Quote, it later became apparent the elevator did not go to the basement that day. End quote. False. Testimony and physical evidence show that the body was moved by way of the elevator from the second floor. Police found drag marks on the basement floor that led from the elevator to the location where the body was found. Conley had been sitting on a wooden box, quote, soliciting those passing by for nickels with which to buy more beer. End quote. False. There is no testimony that this happened. 3 people said they saw James Conley: Mrs. White, E.K. Graham, and O. Tillender. And none claimed they were ever, quote, solicited, end quote, for anything. Frank, quote, did not know, end quote, Mary Fagan. False. Frank at first claimed he, quote, did not know, end quote, Mary, but ample testimony from co-workers and Frank himself proved that he knew her and had had conversations with her. She was one of 4 young women who worked on his floor every day for about a year. Quote, Frank had never met Dalton, and he certainly would never have allowed loose women to be brought to the factory. End quote. False. C.B. Dalton, a white man, gave strong and convincing testimony that he and Frank engaged in sexual encounters with, quote, loose women, end quote, at the factory as Conley stood sentry at the door. The, quote, murder notes, end quote, were created in the basement, not in Frank's office, and were solely Conley's doing. False. Frank's attorney, Henry A. Alexander, was found to have altered data on the factory order form to fit that false theory. Journalist Pierre Van Passen claimed that, quote, teeth marks, end quote, were found on Fagan's body, and that they did not match Frank's dental records. False. No such photos or dental analysis exists. Conley wrote, quote, indecent, end quote, letters to a jail employee named Annie Maud Carter, and he confessed to her. False. The so-called Carter letters were the fraudulent creations of Frank's hired detective, William J. Burns. Carter denied their authenticity and swore that in her conversations with Conley, he always maintained that Leo Frank was guilty of murdering Mary Fagan. Burns and his agents were indicted largely on the basis of those, quote, letters, end quote, and a host of other criminal operations. The term, quote, night witch, end quote, in the murder notes refers to a, quote, Negro legend, end quote, and Frank could not have known this. False. This legend is actually a German fairy tale, and Frank was a German Jew. In fact, the phrase in the notes was a deliberate misspelling of, quote, night watch, end quote, and referred to the factory's black night watchman, Newt Lee, the man whom Frank first tried to implicate in the murder. Conley confessed to, quote, several persons, end quote. Slayton, quote, knew that Conley privately had confessed to the crime for which he blamed Frank, end quote. False. Conley only confessed to helping Frank move the dead body of Mary Fagan, after Frank had already killed her. A dice or card-playing, quote, Negro, end quote, witnessed the murder. Utterly false. Quote, Freeman, end quote, was never identified beyond his surname, even though the stated informant was Atlanta physician J. Calvin Weaver, who served as surgeon for the federal prison where the confession was allegedly made, and where Dr. Weaver would have had direct and clear access to Freeman's full name and legal history. Judge Roan issued a letter exonerating Frank from his deathbed. False. The letter was a clear forgery that emerged from the ranks of Leo Frank's defense attorneys, 2 months after the judge had died. Judge Rohn's family and his pastor repudiated it. Many of the above Frank case falsehoods are in Robert Sherborne's article titled, quote, "Evidence Paints Janitor as Real Killer," end quote. Sherborne raises the thoroughly repudiated charge that James Conley had confessed to his attorney, William Smith, calling it the, quote, "most compelling," end quote, of all his, quote, "proofs," end quote, against Conley. Thus, it is a measure of the quality of the Tennessean spread when the best refutation of its, quote, "most compelling," end quote, claim comes from William Smith himself. In the very press conference in which attorney Smith announced his new epiphany about the innocence of Leo Frank, the Atlanta Constitution reported, quote, "Mr. Smith took pains to state to reporters that Conley had made no damaging admission, and that nothing the Negro had secretly said had influenced his new opinion." End quote. In the end, 83-year-old Alonzo Mann represents not his own memories, but the wishes and desires of his handlers. His total embrace by the Nashville Tennessean and the major Jewish organizations, Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Committee, and the Atlanta Jewish Federation, reflects their desire to inflate the elderly man's credibility for no other reason than to better exploit him. And when one confronts the elaborate scheme to graft Mann's fictional chapter onto the Leo Frank affair, it quickly collapses in the light of the facts of the case and the inability of their elderly hero to uphold key elements of the story. Mann's dubious, quote, "recollections," end quote, are not genuine memories, for they conflict irreconcilably with those held by the man whose reputation and legacy Mann believed he was trying to save, Leo Frank. Last, it is important to consider what may have driven Alonzo Mann out of the dark after 69 years of silence on the matter of who killed Mary Fagan. Mann's own lawyer, having assisted in setting up that disastrous private hearing in 1982 in front of members of the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles, revealed something far more significant than his client ever divulged. John J. Hooker disclosed that behind the carefully scripted Alonzo Mann, quote, "revelation," end quote, is a book and movie deal executed by the two main Tennessean, quote, "journalists," end quote, Robert Sherborne and Jerry Thompson. Hooker said that those two newspapermen, quote, "would be in control of the Alonzo Mann story," end quote. Turns out that Mann had, quote, "entered into a written agreement with those two gentlemen," end quote. Despite the claim of conscience clearing after 69 years, it appears Mann was induced to come forward because of clear publicity and monetary enticements. Posthumous pardon timeline. March 4th, 1982. Alonzo Mann, in failing health, signed an affidavit asserting Leo Frank's innocence and Jim Conley's guilt. He admitted he had seen Conley carrying the limp body of Mary Fagan on his shoulder near the trap door leading to the basement on April 26, 1913. March 7, 1982. The Nashville Tennessean ran a special supplement with the story of Alonzo Mann's confession, which bore the headline, quote, "An innocent man was lynched," end quote. November 10, 1982. Alonzo Mann repeated his story in a videotaped statement in Atlanta. January 4, 1983. Based largely on Alonzo Mann's testimony, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Atlanta Jewish Federation, Incorporated, submitted to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles an application for a posthumous pardon for Leo Frank. August 8, 1983. Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles hears case for Frank pardon. December 22, 1983. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied the motion for a pardon because, while Alonzo Mann's testimony might incriminate Jim Conley, it did not conclusively prove the innocence of Leo Frank. March 11, 1986. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles finally issued a posthumous pardon to Leo Frank on the basis of the state's failure to protect him while in custody. It did not officially absolve him of the crime. Be with us again next time when we present the next chapter of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 3. The Leo Frank Case, The Lynching of a Guilty Man. Prepared by the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam, Chicago, Illinois. Copyright 2016 by Latimer Associates. All rights reserved. Published in audiobook form by the American Mercury with permission of the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of